Hello, I'm Sally Hogg, and this is the Mobilise podcast from the Centre for Research on Play in Education, Development and Learning at the University of Cambridge. Mobilise is a mini-series in which I talk to leading policymakers and politicians from across the UK about how research can be used in policy to improve children's lives. We'll be finding out about the things our guests have achieved for children and about the challenges that arise when trying to use research-based evidence in complex political environments. If you've got any interest in research, child development and children's policy, then this is a podcast for you. Today, I'm speaking to Tim Loughton. Until last month, Tim was the Conservative Member of Parliament for East Worthing and Shoreham. Tim was Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Children and Families in the UK from 2010 to 2012. Prior to that, he was the Shadow Children's Minister. Tim was a committed advocate for children in Parliament and was the chair of the all-party parliamentary groups for children and for the first 1,001 days, and a member of groups on youth, adoption, care experienced young people and kinship care. Until 2020, Tim was the chair of the infant mental health charity, the Parent Infant Foundation. Tim is an alumni of Cambridge, having studied a Masters in Archaeology here before embarking on his career in the city. Tim, hello, it's great to see you.
Hi, good to see you, Sally.
So, you achieved a lot for children during your time as an MP and a minister. What are you proudest of?
Well, I wish I'd achieved a lot more, having been Shadow Children's Minister for many years and then Children's Minister for about 2.5 years. But in that time, we achieved an awful lot. The thing I think we spent a lot of time on was on adoption. And adoption was an area of children's policy which I think had been overlooked. The number of adoptions have gone down a lot, and we completely overhauled the system there. Alas, it's gone back into decline after that time. We also did a lot around child sexual exploitation, and I produced the government CSE action plan back in 2011 before the whole Jimmy Savile thing came about, which really opened up the floodgates for CSE and people appreciating what CSE actually was, and it was going on all around us. So I think that was a particularly important piece of work that we did. And then also around youth policy generally, we published the Positive for Youth policy document in 2011, which was all about how we can get the voice of children and young people at the top table, influencing local policy makers, councillors, MPs, and really giving them a say. I mean, there was a lot we did. I think those three things I would flag up as things I was most proud of, as well as all the stuff we did in children's social care, generally fostering and so on.
Yeah, great achievements. And to what extent do you think those things have left a legacy? One of the frustrations, as you alluded to a little bit in government, is that you can put changes in place and then they change as other government ministers come in or agendas go down the political priority list. What do you think has been left as a legacy from that work?
I mean, that's really frustrating. It's what I've learned in my 27 years as an MP in Parliament, as how things come and go, how policies become fashionable, topical, and you can put a heck of a lot of effort in it. You can really focus your Department of Civil Servants on it. You can make some achievements, but then if it's no longer a priority, if you then have a new minister comes in, let alone a change of government, all of a sudden it goes into reverse. And adoption was a really good example of that. It was something that Tony Blair's government did in his second term with some adoption legislation, and we saw the numbers in adoption tick up a bit. And then it went all the way back again. So we did some work ahead of 2010. It was one of the things we really sort of hit the ground running with in 2010 and tried to overhaul the whole system. It wasn't just about getting numbers up. It was about getting numbers up sustainably, and particularly those kids who are the most difficult to get adopted. So it meant recruiting more parents, giving more flexibility and encouragement to parents, and getting kids into adoption much more quickly. The whole system was taking far too long. So we overhauled the whole system, and within a couple of years of my demise, because it takes a long time to go through, we had more than doubled the number of children being adopted. But really importantly, we got far more older children getting adopted who've been in the care system for much longer than they needed to have been. Since then, I'm afraid, numbers have halved again. And that just shows how you've got to keep policy priorities on the radar and be able to hand over to subsequent ministers to keep those policies focused, let alone handing over to subsequent governments. And the real worry now is if we have a change of government, by the time this podcast goes out, we probably would have had a change of government. And the whole work that the government's done, which I was part of, Andrew Ledson was part of, and you were part of, Sally, in the Best Start in Life programme, which I think has been a really, really good programme, but it's only just started and it's not nearly finished. And if the next government doesn't treat it as a priority, it's back to square one. And that's why we so need long-term programs that cut across party divides, that are based on good research, good outcomes, good evidence, and that can survive changes of government and administration and individual ministers.
Yes, and let's hope there is that ongoing focus on babies and young children in whichever government we get next. You, when you moved on from being Children's Minister, have been a very proactive backbencher. What do you think is the role of backbenchers in keeping things on government's radar and up the agenda?
That's what a backbencher is all about. It's about holding the government to account, and that matters whether it's the government is your own party, as it has been with me for the last 14 years, or whether it's an opposing party. And one good way of being able to do that is through the use of all-party parliamentary groups, which bring together parliamentarians from both the Commons and the Lords across party, works with lots of outside bodies. The good APPGs have good secretariats. You were part of the secretariat for the 2001 days. It's usually good charities like the Parent Infant Foundation for 1001 days. The National Children's Bureau was the secretariat to the all-party children's group. And they can do their own research, commission reports, but importantly recruit other MPs and members of the Lords to the cause to flag up issues of concern, to get them to be advocates for whatever aspect of children's social care we're talking about in this case in Parliament, amending legislation when there's appropriate legislation, and badgering and lobbying ministers to make things a priority and to devote resources and devote government time to them.
In your role as an APP chair, what were some of the things that you really managed to push through and get back onto government's radar?
Well, I think the first 1001 days group, which was set up by Andrea Ledson, when we had the whole first 1001 days manifesto, that goes back to 2011, 2012. And that really hit the headlines because Andrea and others were relentless in saying, all this stuff about children's social care and children's mental health in schools and so on is great and important. But actually, what's even more important is doing it earlier and intervening earlier, and that starts at conception. So if you've got children who have been born to stressed mothers suffering from perinatal mental illness, suffering from domestic abuse, and they don't form that strong attachment, then though you're just setting up those children to have all the problems when they get to school, let alone before that. And I think that was something that wasn't really appreciated. And all the research that backed that up to show how children who were not properly attached, how their brains just developed more slowly and differently, really showed quite starkly what a false economy it was not to be intervening and giving that important, crucial support so much earlier. And I think 20 years ago, most MPs would not have heard about that. I think now, although a lot of MPs still need to know more, it's not such a sort of off-piste subject anymore. And because of that, government ministers did take notice. Opposition frontbenchers and others took notice and joined together, and out of that was born the Best Start in Life project, which is all about appreciating how you need a proper joined-up approach as early as possible to support those parents from conception going forward. So that's a really important lobbying and pressure that backbenchers operating through all-party groups, operating with charities, academics, organisations who really know about this stuff, bringing all that together to get policy changed, get resources allocated to the right place, and for policy to really shape people's lives as it will in this case.
I've been reading some of the party manifestos in the last few weeks, and I think one of the things that's been disappointing in those is that despite all of that amazing work and the fact that babies and the first 1,001 days were being mentioned more and more in Parliament and the Start for Life programme began, across the board, there's very little recognition of the importance of those first few years of life and the stuff that happens before and around the edges of childcare and early education in any of the parties' manifestos. Why do you think this is an issue that, despite those kind of waves of support, doesn't really quite stick on the political priority list?
Yeah, frustrating, isn't it? And it's nothing new. Children have been unfashionable for so long. Children, disadvantaged children, are particularly unfashionable, and yet so much of what government has to do is dealing with the problems that are caused by not giving kids the best start in life. And it's such a false economy, as we've constantly said. All the costs of perinatal mental illness and of child abuse and child neglect and everything as well. And I mean, we have achieved quite a lot in putting on the radar, but it just doesn't feature as a sort of top 6 policy. If we look at social care, what the parties are going on about is adult social care. Is how we're going to sort out the problem with, the costs of care homes and bed blocking and getting people out of hospital. Really important issue, and impacts on many constituents of people standing for Parliament. But the trouble is that children's issues, when you have the interface with local authorities and the state, well, that's only something that affects a small amount of problematic kids, and they don't have the vote anyway. And that is so blind and such a false economy, because, as I've said, if you don't help them early, then you are dealing very expensively with the problems later on. The cost £15 billion a year, the cost of child neglect, £8.1 billion a year, the cost of perinatal mental illness. So we're spending in those two areas £23 billion a year just to support the price of failure, whereas spending a fraction of that early on could be saving so much financially as well as socially as well. But we've still not got through to everybody that spending early and intervening early has such an impact, a lifelong impact. And when we have manifestos which recognise that, then I know that our job is nearly done. But we've made some progress, but goodness, we've still got a long way to go. And it's so frustrating when children are not front and centre of so many party manifestos. And it's the same with all the parties, I'm afraid.
Yes, it feels really noticeable at this election. You talked about, when you were talking about things you're proud of, the work to really make children and young people's voices central to government policy making. Do you think if children and young people had more of a voice, for example, lowering the voting age or being at leaders' debates, or is there a way in which giving young children and young people a voice could help bring children's policies up the priority list?
Yes, I hope so. There's some really good work that's been going on by the Children's Commissioner, who has also championed this cause as well. She's interviewed, I think it's more than 350,000 kids. And our all-party group has been part of that as well, is in trying to flag up policies that young people want to see governments bring in. And we've made suggestions for what should be in manifestos for the various parties, as identified by children and young people themselves. And when you look at what they come up with, this isn't rocket science, and this isn't stuff that just children are concerned about. It's cost of living stuff, it's housing, and it's transport, and also particularly it's around mental health. I think that's what's changed over the last 20 or so years, is that children and young people are identifying mental health issues for children and young people as an issue that was almost a taboo subject 20 years ago, not something that they discussed. I think it's great a sign of progress that people freely, both in Parliament and young kids and families, now discuss and are much more aware to mental health issues. And that's where we need to listen to young people. The impact that social media is having on young people. A lot of interesting research that's been done there. So, why do we need to spend so much money on expensive research in many cases when we can listen to young people themselves for their own voices and their own experiences? And that's why I've always been such a champion of talking to the customer. That's what in the Department for Education, I regularly every quarter used to have 4 panels of a group of kids who are in foster care, a group of kids who are in residential care, a group of kids who recently left care, and a group of kids who were adopted, just to sit them down to tell me, okay, what's your experiences? What's going on in your life? What's going right? What's going wrong? And that's where I got my very best information. Listen to the voices of children and young people themselves, not their spokesman. Listen to them.
And can you give any examples of specific insights you got from those young people, or a new way of thinking about something?
What I heard loud and clear from my care leavers group is that care leavers were supposed to have PAs, their personal assistants, to help them, guide the way through moving out of care into adulthood, and too many of them didn't even know the name of theirs, or whether they actually had them. I heard from kids who were in foster care or adopted how too many sibling groups were being broken up. Which seemed to me, in some limited cases, it might be in their best interest when those siblings are broken up. But in most cases, when you've come from a broken home, one of the few anchors and consistency you've still got is a brother or sister. And so not to be doing more to keep those kids together. And it's difficult when you've got larger families, but that's why one of the things we looked at is how we can help fund people who are taking on foster groups or adoptive groups. Might mean expanding their house, building an extension so they've got an extra bedroom, so they've physically got the room to do it. And the cost of doing that actually could be far less than the cost of splitting all those kids up and the problems that they were causing. So those few examples of some of the real life experiences we got from the kids on the ground. And when I went to visit local authorities who've been failed by Ofsted, I always made a point of, usually what used to happen is you just invited in the Director of Children's Services and the Chief Executive perhaps, and gave them the dressing down in the Department for Education. Well, I actually always went to visit the local authority with civil servants, would speak to all the great and the good, and then I would ask to go out with social workers, go and speak to social workers and hear from them exactly what was going on the ground. And so often you tended to get a rather different version of events to what you'd heard from the management, who had tried to say, everything's fine, we're on top of it. But actually going out with the social workers, talking to some of the families they're dealing with, talking to the children they were looking after, that's where you get your best information, and that most informed my policy at my time in the DFE.
That's great. Thank you, Tim. I wanted to talk a little bit around the use of research evidence when you were in DFE. So we're really interested in this podcast in exploring how research can help in policymaking and when that's useful and when it's more difficult. Can you remember a piece of research evidence that really informed policy during your time as Children's Minister?
Absolutely. And the very first review I commissioned, and interestingly, it was the very first review that was commissioned in the DFE after the election in 2010. There's a criticism that the incoming Conservative government was only concerned about education, and of course the renaming of the Department for Children, Schools and Families to Department for Education got a lot of criticism, because were we then shelving all the children's social care stuff, which was my responsibility? I was keen to say, look, we've changed the name, but it doesn't mean we've changed the priorities. The very first piece of research and review that we commissioned was the Munro review, where we got Eileen Munro from LSE, brought her in and gave her a pretty broad canvas to say, how do we sort out the role of social workers and make sure that they are spending their time most productively achieving the best outcomes for those families that they look after, because research had shown that in some cases social workers were spending up to 85% of their time in front of a computer screen. A huge amount of bureaucracy that was involved, all the form filling they had to do for every case. Whereas the most valuable thing about a social worker is that face-to-face time that they get, looking around somebody's house, looking for those telltale signs, flagging up problems, using their gut instinct, using their training, and yet they were spending their whole time filling in forms on a computer and abiding by the working together manual, which was, I think, when we took over 750 pages long. So they're spending all their time going through the rule book and desperately trying to do what it said in the rule book, rather than being a social worker. And a social work is not an exact science. And one of the things I was my sort of bottom line was we need to allow social workers the freedom to get it wrong. Hopefully not often, but you will get it wrong from time to time. But I'd much rather that they use their instinct, their gut feeling, their training, their expertise that they learnt on the job to make a value judgment, rather than, well, this is what it says on page 47 of the Working Together manual, and try to apply that to a specific case. So the Munro review was so crucial about what really matters in social work. How do we free up social workers to do their job better? How do we get those better outcomes for kids? And so the first thing we did was to slim down that Working Together manual by more than 3/4, so that social workers just had some clear guidelines of what was expected of them, and then allowed to get on with the job. And the Munro review and the 15 main recommendations that came out of that was all about freeing up social workers to apply their professionalism.
And looking back kind of a decade on, can you see sustained changes from the work that you did as a result of that review?
Well, we certainly saw some improvements, but again, I fear because government took its eye off the ball, and this stuff needs to be chaperoned through over many years to absolutely instill it into best practice. But certainly, we freed up much more time. As I say, we reduced the amount of admin and bureaucracy they had to do. We took away a lot of the specific target times that they had to adhere to, which applied, across the whole board, rather than for them to be able to say, look, this family is a real priority. We need to throw everything at that family now, even if it means an extra day or so for this less urgent family case that they're looking up. But I think overall the problem still is, Sally, that the caseload for social workers is too high because we still don't have enough social workers. We tried to improve the standing and the reputation of social workers, but still social workers have a pretty negative view in the eyes of the media, and when we produced a document called No More Blame Game, which was a commission on the social work which I chaired when we were in opposition, I think that was a really important document, because it was all about saying, look, let's not just blame social workers every time a child gets killed or abused. They're not the ones who are responsible for it. Why is the system allowing mistakes to be made, and how do we improve the system to allow social workers, the good, decent social workers that most of them are, to be able to get on with their job effectively? Now, that means weeding out and being pretty tough on those social workers who are not up to it, but the vast majority are in difficult circumstances. But the problem is, we are still not recruiting enough, and it's still not seen as a profession that some people want to go in. And it should be. It's the fourth emergency service, frankly. So that's the problem. You can change the rules, but if you're not encouraging enough good people into it, and given that we've got a record number of children in the care system, and a social worker's job is getting more and more, then you're not going to be able to achieve what you need to achieve. So it's got to be a combination of changing procedures and regulations and legislation. But that's only a small part of it. You've actually got to get the people to do that job. And I think the mistake of governments before was to address children's social care issues, and particularly around CSE and safeguarding, is that you just needed more legislation. And the problem was we had too much legislation and too big a rule book, and that was getting in the way of social workers being able to do their job effectively.
Thank you. I wonder if some of the things you're saying about the value placed on social work and social workers and being able to recruit into that profession links back to what we were talking about earlier around the priority given to children in this country generally, and the value we give on children and the services that work with them.
Yes, and as I said earlier, that there is a sort of perception through local government that children's social care only applies to a certain group of children who are, from the other side of town. It doesn't really affect our community, whereas every child, certainly should, goes to school. So if you're a local authority, then education is going to play a far more important point, because every family that's got children is going to be impacted by local schools and education provision, whereas it's only a small but growing number of children who come into contact with children's social care services, social workers and others. But if you look at attachment, and again, the work that we did here of where those kids who have poor attachment come from, it's from across the whole social piece. I mean, we saw many families with high quality professional jobs who were suffering from poorly attached children and perinatal mental health. So it's a fallacy to think that this is only something that affects other types of people, whatever that may be, in other communities. But I think that's really why there's this misnomer that actually it's only a small part of the community, a small problematic number of children who are impacted. It's not, and the impact that they can have anyway is considerable. Because of the disruption it can bring to families, to other children, to schools, to crime and so on. And to address it early has to be the right policy.
The Munro example is a brilliant example of research and academics supporting policymakers. If you look back more generally, to what extent do you think policy was evidence-based during your time in government?
So, I mean, this was a really interesting area. And when I came in, the Department for Education, or Department for Children, Schools and Families as it was, had commissioned a huge amount of research. And I was struggling to appreciate what a lot of that research was for and what it was achieving. And there was a bit of a blitz on research within the department early on. And so, we were put under pressure to justify what all this research was actually achieving. And for somebody who absolutely believes in evidence-based policy and that you need to commission that and have good research, I really struggled to know why on earth we seem to be doing an awful lot of this stuff. So a lot of the research was reduced. Although, as I say, on really important issues, we brought in Eileen Munro and others, and I also had a number of working parties which I put together, which contained, some of the regular suspects from academia, from practitioners, from children's social care, from children's organisations or whatever. But also, I added some new people to them, particularly practitioners. So on the adoption working groups we had, I introduced some judges, and I also introduced some parents who were adopters and parents who wanted to be adopters, to hear from them as well. So I think it was right probably to cut down on research where it was not clear what it was actually doing and where it could impact on outcomes. But I think the pendulum swung too much, and certainly I think in recent years it's become clear that there is a shortage of research coming through the DFE to inform policy. So it has gone too far the other way. But there were some fairly basic things around adoption. A fundamental question I ask is how many adoptions fail, and nobody knew. There seemed to be no research to show that, was it 10%, was it 20%, was it 30% of adoptions failed. So we're throwing all this money and time at getting adoptions, but how did we know that in 5 years' time they were going to be successful adoptions and we were doing it the right way, which was and getting that information right was fundamental to having the sort of pre-adoption support and the money which went in and the social impact bonds, which are a really innovative and interesting way of putting money up front to make sure that adoptive parents had all the support, particularly dealing with children who had behavioural and other problems, to give it a much better chance than 5 years' time, which was usually the benchmark, that was still a strong adoptive placement and it had worked. So there was some fundamental stuff we had no research on, and a whole lot of other stuff which I didn't understand, which you had lots of research on. It was difficult to see what that research was actually achieving.
Interesting. And I think listening to you there's something about just building the right data collection into the system. So building something about, do we know how many adoptions are still going 5 years later that's just systematically collected? When you were thinking about what research to keep and what to get rid of, what did you see as useful research? And maybe the counter to that, what was not helpful?
Well, I think that the useful research was something where you could clearly apply it to an area, a priority area within the department, and where it could impact on outcomes. I mean, the question I constantly asked in everything we did was always, how is this going to improve the outcomes we have for children? Whether it be more permanent adoptions, whether it meant in the care system that they would achieve better at school, not get into trouble, whether it meant we were recruiting more foster carers because we were looking after them better. Where was the evidence that it would produce or likely produce a better outcome? And there's, as you know, around children's policies, there's lots of wonderful theories and research and all sorts of psychological impacts and all that sort of thing. But how does that lead to the children that we are responsible for as a department actually doing better and getting a better chance to have a stable upbringing and a loving family? And if I couldn't, after intensive questioning who'd ever commissioned the research, get an answer to that, then was that research really worth commissioning? I think that was always the bottom line for me. And I'm sure I made some mistakes in some cases, and I threw out some research that could have been really, really useful. But I'm not saying we didn't do any research at all. We did a heck of a lot. But I liked to see people with real life experience behind that research. And the department made mistakes after my time with causes like Kids Company, where an awful lot of money went into that charity against my better judgment. But ultimately, nobody seemed to be able to produce the outcomes of how many children were doing so much better for whatever reason as a result of that investment in Kids Company, other than what the head of Kids Company was constantly telling us, but without producing the empirical evidence to back it up. But hey, that's a whole different podcast.
Yes. As a minister, I guess the Kids Company is a sort of example of that. You're balancing lots of competing priorities, personalities, political priorities, the media, and what evidence is showing. Can you tell us a bit about how you navigated those situations? And particularly, I guess, if there were examples where maybe what the evidence showed didn't fit with wider politics or priorities?
Well, I had a very open door, and as I've always done, I wanted to work cross-party as well. So Um, and I like to go out and get my own experience. And I think you'll remember that what I did was that each year I'd spend a week during the summer recess going off working with professionals. For my first year, I went up to Stockport and just spent a week with social workers, there being one of them. And goodness knows they took me deliberately, I think, to some pretty challenging cases. And I did the overnight emergency line, and I went to the police briefings. And that was hugely insightful about what the people we were responsible for were actually having to cope with day to day on the front line. And actually, the MP for Stockport at the time, who was a Labour MP, I did it entirely with her knowledge, and she'd done a lot of good work around missing children as well. So on one of the working parties I set up around missing children, and how we did the return interviews and things like that to make sure that it was less likely to do it again. She was a key member of that, and put a name to some of the research which we commissioned. And I think that's really, really important, and that's why the Best Start in Life work that we've done. Andrew Leadsom and I absolutely went out of our way to go and speak to the front benches of all the other parties and get them on working groups to be part of it. So there was a joint ownership, because this isn't terribly partisan. This is not party political. Trying to get the best outcomes for children. We all want that. We just got different emphasis to it. There was a really good case in point, though. One of the things which we had opposed in opposition was the new computer database called Contact Point. This was something which the previous government had committed to, was going to be a database of every child in the country, which a lot of organisations had a problem with, and I absolutely shared that concern. And yet the government had spent several £100 million on it. So we opposed the legislation that brought it in. In my view, it was never going to do what it was all cracked up to be doing anyway. And also it had, serious information confidentiality issues, and there's a whole Big Brother aspect to it. And so we opposed it, and we said that we would abolish it if we were elected in 2010, and that was quite a big call. I'm absolutely convinced it was the right thing to do, and nobody remembers Contact Point now, frankly, unless you were perhaps one of the civil servants who worked on it. But what I had to do then was to go and tell a whole load of civil servants who'd spent their lives setting up this huge behemoth of a computer system that, I'm sorry, we're going to switch it off. And to give credit to the professionalism of the civil servants in the Department for Education, the director responsible and his team came to see me early on and basically said, Minister, we understand that you're committed to scrapping Contact Point. Our job is to make that as smooth and problem-free as possible, which I think is quite a tribute on something that they, their baby they put together. Sorry, we're going to dismantle it. They appreciated our reasons for doing that, and I think it was the right decision. So you had to keep civil servants on side. You had to try and keep engagement with other political parties, and then you have a whole host of vested interests within the children and young people's sector, not least a lot of youth groups who have a lot of personality clashes between the various people who run them. So I always got as many people around the table as possible, and always made sure that those people who didn't get on with each other had to sit next to each other, because we had a single joint purpose, and that was to get the best deal for children and young people, and they need to put their egos aside and get on with that. So it was quite a juggling act and all those things, but I rather enjoyed it. And that was one of the challenges of being a minister.
Thank you. And always good to hear about a good word for the civil service as well, as a former civil servant. Tim, we've just got time for one last question before we finish. And I wondered, you're obviously now stepping away from Parliament, but thinking about the next government, what is your parting message for the next children's minister? What do you think should be their priority as they come into government, whoever they might be?
So the great phrase which I take responsibility for having coined, and I hear so much these days. Children and young people are 20% of the population, but 100% of the future, and you ignore that at your peril. And you have got to absolutely start as early as possible. And that's why the Best Start in Life project and all the work that so many well-intentioned and knowledgeable organisations have been part of, including yourself, Sally, is so important. And if we can get that right, and if we get on page 1 of the manifestos in the next election, that getting it right for children and their parents early on, from conception to age 2, is a given, then I think we will have achieved something. So that's why it's really important. I hope if there is a new incoming government, obviously I hope there isn't a new incoming government, but if by the time this goes out there's a new incoming government, I hope they will pick up the work that Andrea Leadsom and others did and carried on, because it's only just started, but it's absolutely vital to making sure that we have children who've given the very best chance in life before they get to school, and we've got happier, healthier families as a result.
That's definitely a fantastic message to end on. And are you going to continue to champion this from outside the House, Tim?
There's no way I couldn't. So, it's been my life for the last, most of my 27 years in Parliament. Obviously, there are other things I'm going to be doing, but it also frees up some of my time to concentrate more on important children's stuff. And I've already been approached by various children's organisations to be part of this ongoing work. So I will find new platforms to champion it, because I don't need convincing that it's the most important part of any government's work, but government continues to need to be prodded to get it right.
Well, it's great that you're going to stick around and keep prodding whoever is in government. Thank you very much, Tim. It's been great to talk to you.
And you.
Before we go, I'd like to remind our listeners that if you enjoyed listening to the conversation with Tim, please do check out the other podcasts in our series, which you can find on whichever platform you get your podcasts. And please tell your colleagues about the Mobilise podcast too. Mobilise is a mini-series created by the Centre for Research on Play in Education and Development and Learning here at the University of Cambridge. For more information about Pedal and to access our wider resources, please visit our website, pedalhub.net. Thank you for listening.